I think as a country, we still put too much emphasis on treatment of poor health and preventing it. And most of the modern mental health innovation is still often in the form of treatment. But decreasing stress and improving our social experiences and our interpersonal effectiveness are critical preventative efforts to better health.
Welcome to Market Makers, the podcast where we dive into the minds of innovators and disruptors shaping the future of business and technology. My name is Troy Duffie, Director of Financial Markets at the Milken Institute. And today we're exploring how artificial intelligence is revolutionizing mental health care. Joining us is our friend James, the CEO of Scenario, a groundbreaking mental health platform that leverages AI and immersive visualization to help users role play through life's toughest challenges. From confronting anxiety to improving social interactions, Scenario is redefining how people approach mental wellness, offering dynamic, personalized experiences. James is going to share how AI and role-playing are transforming therapy and mental health support, and what the future holds for this exciting intersection of technology and care. You don't want to miss this one. Let's get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Troy Duffie. I'm Director of Financial Markets at the Milken Institute.
And I'm Lenore Beirne, the founder and managing partner at Bright Ventures.
Our podcast is really focused on inclusive capitalism. What that means for us is building an economy that includes everyone, that has long-term value for all stakeholders.
In this episode of our podcast, we will explore how one innovator is using generative AI to help people practice and problem solve for important conversations. James, it's great to have you. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Will you tell us a little bit about Scenario and the problem it seeks to solve?
Yeah, at the core, it's a social disconnection problem. I think this is the problem of this generation. And I don't mean this generation as Gen Z. Gen Z is absolutely part of this, but for all of us. We have become increasingly disconnected from each other, mostly from technology. And this also isn't to say all technology is bad. Of course not. All social media is not bad. There are absolutely great use cases of it. And it's not just a social media problem either. Think of how often now we order DoorDash or Uber Eats instead of just going down to the restaurant and picking it up and having a conversation with that restaurateur. Like we don't have the tight-knit communities that we used to have. And so this social disconnection problem has a cascading effect on all sorts of health issues, productivity issues, relationship issues. And it's just become so easy to avoid interacting with people and avoid situations and live in our own kind of echo chambers. And so the core of that is, how do you get people to lean back in to situations that they avoid, they find stressful, that they find difficult, or they just keep putting off things they know they need to do, or conversations they know need to have, they're just not having it. How do we get people to lean back in? That's the problem in the essence that we have always been trying to solve, and we're definitely solving for now, is social disconnection. Stress is related to that, of course, because we often avoid things that we find stressful, and then that often exacerbates our stress, doesn't help it. So there's a lot of folks are using it for situations they find stressful. They might not involve other people. They might just be things they're putting off, like doing your taxes. However, at the core, I would say it's a social disconnection problem that we're seeking to address.
Can you talk us through, what led you to this work? Before you do that, I want to say we were joking before we started that we should have visualized this conversation, but talk us through like how you got here and why it's so important in terms of what you're doing.
So prior to this journey it's been a journey to get here and figure out the kind of product market fit that we're excited to finally have. I was a led product strategy at TikTok. And before that, Musically, we got bought by ByteDance at TikTok. It was a wild ride, as you can probably imagine. Spent most of my time in China, learned a lot, grew a lot. But as TikTok became what it is today, and it sort of morphed from the early days of rather benign dance and lip sync videos to the proliferation of content that's on there today, there are, of course, a lot of issues with user safety. And that's not unique to TikTok. I don't want to pretend that that is a TikTok problem. That's a social media, consumption media problem in our world. So while there, I started looking in to these issues, started talking about it internally. As you can imagine, there wasn't a lot of reception internally for tackling these things beyond what we felt was kind of minimum needed. And so I became more and more motivated to figure out what was causing, like, the problems that TikTok contributes to and social media and consumption media contribute to more holistically. The one that stuck out to me was disconnection, social disconnection. And that it felt like we are living in an increasingly disconnected world. It's so easy to avoid people. It's so easy to avoid conversations you don't want to have. You know, hundreds of years ago, right, we were kind of always living in physical communities. We now live in this digital world where it's just easy. It's become easy to escape. Sometimes it's healthy. I don't want to pretend that escaping and avoiding is always bad. It's not. But too much of it is very adverse. So the social disconnection problem really stood out to me as I was examining the landscape of social media and my own career, because prior to TikTok, I was at Snapchat. And that stuck out to me as, like, this is a big problem. I felt I've played a hand, albeit a small one, in contributing to it. And that was sort of motivation one. The second one was more of a personal one. I have dealt with social anxiety and interpersonal challenges my entire life. We're not going to go into like childhood and why, because I know that's not the point of this podcast. But as I got into my own adulthood, I had a hard time dealing with confrontation. I lack self-awareness in a lot of times in my own interactions with people. I had a hard time managing relationships, and I was very lonely. And during my late 20s and early 30s were probably some of the loneliest time in my life. And it led to depression. It led to stress, bad health, you name it. And so this was also a personal issue for me that I've dealt with. And looking back now, the product that we've built, like if you had been able to put that in my 18, 20-year-old hands, like when I was that age, my life probably would have played out differently. I would have more bountiful relationships than I have now. Fortunately, I have been working on that for several years, and in part because of the work we're doing here, but it's a personal one as well.
I feel like James is trying to solve ghosting. That's what
Ghosting is part of it. And
yeah.
James, I want to acknowledge, I'm so grateful that you're sharing sort of the personal side as well as the macro view on that, because it really is a problem across all types of people, across generations, across socioeconomics, genders, and more. And so I'm grateful for you sort of connecting those dots for us. It's also just a complex problem, as you sort of noted here. Social media is absolutely part of, and I think there's even data that tie together social media and mental health at the population level. But can you help us understand, of all the ways that you could have addressed this issue of disconnection, how did you land on the current version of Scenario as the one to double down on and build a business?
Yeah, so there's been 3 iterations of this company and this journey. The first, we started with a social audio app in order to create safe spaces for people to talk about challenges they were having, mostly around mental health. That was during the pandemic. Along with other social audio platforms in the pandemic, it had a lot of activity. We were very excited by it. But 2 things kind of stood out. One, as people got back out of their homes and resumed their day-to-day life, that social audio space wasn't as sticky. But more importantly, that space turned into very performative. So often it was the people that were most confident that were kind of taking over the rooms in these peer-to-peer settings, and the people that were struggling, that needed the help, weren't necessarily getting it consistently from that experience. So that led us down the path of looking at social anxiety more specifically, and exposure therapy, which is sort of one of the most evidence-based ways to address social anxiety or any other phobia. Social anxiety essentially is a phobia of fear and judgment at its core. We created that product to help give people kind of a subclinical way to do exposure therapy and track exposures. And while the core product wasn't effective, mostly because people couldn't get over their fears of doing the exposures they were signing up for. The one thing that was working was we started having our coaches, which was part of that experience, do these text-based visualization exercises with folks where they would just go back and forth over text, visualizing the situation that they're stuck on, the exposure challenge assignment they're stuck on. And we saw how effective that was and how much engaging that was, even though there was that lag time right between the text back and forth. It wasn't very immersive, but it was still working. And that was in 2023. And we realized with the advent of GenAI and these language learning models that we could take our training data, our clinical science, clinical protocols with these LLMs to produce essentially visualizations on demand at scale for people in an effective way. So in a way, there's no way we would have been able to build this product even had we had the insight when we met Lenore in 2022. We sort of had to get here the hard way and keep things going to that point. And that was the journey of how we got here.
The problem seems like a very human one, right? It seems social anxiety is a human problem. How have you introduced AI to kind of solve that problem?
Yeah, so it's a very human one. And like with anything else human, it's very complex. People's social structure, their social DNA, how they show up in different situations is very, very nuanced. So it's a very important place to get right and to be mindful of how you're using AI. And that's the first thing that I think often stands out to folks in this discussion is we're not unleashing you to a chatbot to just start having a back and forth and diagnosing your situation and giving you advice of what to do. We believe that in some cases that could go perfectly fine, but too often it might not. So what we're really doing is we're using AI to help simulate the situation so that you can explore different possibilities and you can navigate it on your own. We're not trying to be prescriptive with AI. We're not trying to let AI almost give you advice on what to do with your life and your situation. We're just using it to help you explore possibilities, and that you also ultimately are going to choose your own path. So there's a few different ways specifically we use AI in the product today. The first is helping guide you in how to structure your thoughts on the situation you're facing. So whether I'm avoiding my taxes, or I just got in a fight with a neighbor, or I want to ask somebody out on a date, or I have a job interview. These are all types of things people use the app for. It helps you think through your goal, what's blocking you, what you're worried could go wrong. And it's learning about the context of the situation and giving you suggestions of things that you might consider. But ultimately, you're making the choice. Then we use it to retrieve recommendations from our clinical database. So when it comes to recommending approaches, that's actually all of our data that we've trained AI on how to retrieve given the context of your situation. The third way is you use it to simulate it. So adding the dialogue, the descriptors. We essentially, it's like watching yourself in a TV script or a movie script in that scene. You can also play it back with audio as well. And so that's the third way we use it to now bring the situation to life. Then we use it to identify insights. So what are the skills and techniques being used in that situation socially from interpersonal skills? And then the fourth one is we use it to analyze for safety. So we look at everything from, sort of, I would say the more obvious cases like suicidality to things that are more nuanced like eating disorders. And we analyze the simulation. And if we see any flags there that are tripped essentially, it routes to our clinical team where we can direct resources to you. And we also let you know that in the app as well. So those are the 5 ways the product uses AI today.
I played with Scenario recently to practice a difficult conversation, and it helped tremendously. I think I ran maybe 5 visualizations before I said, okay, yeah, this is actually the way I want it to go. So James, just really grateful for your awesome continued work in this space and the depth that you and your team take on clinical and evidence-based approaches to social anxiety. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Outside of Scenario, James, are there other places that you're building an inclusive economy that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, the other side of my life is the work I do in climate and conservation work. The climate work I do both as an angel investor, I've also had a podcast that I need to get back to.
Tell us
Really
about the
enjoyed.
podcast, James.
I know. It's been dormant for a little over a year, but I had produced about 80, 90 episodes. It's no small work putting a podcast together, as you both
We
know.
have found that out.
Yeah. And so that was talking about different climate and like I want to unpack climate a little bit, and I sort of have one of my things, my advocacy in that area is we should stop using the word climate change. We should stop talking about it as climate change because it's not very effective, and it sort of creates an easy avenue for that straw man argument of the climate is always changing, which is true, and it creates confusion for people. We really should be talking about the specific aspect, global warming and biodiversity collapse as the two sort of linchpins instead of climate change. But yeah, so I do advocacy work there and investment work. That's one thing that touches everybody, and people who are the most socioeconomic disadvantaged and disenfranchised are going to be affected the most from the adverse effects of global warming and biodiversity collapse. So that absolutely, I think any talk about an inclusive economy, inclusive capitalism has to start with how we're addressing that macro problem. We've already crossed a tipping point. There are going to be really bad things that come no matter what, but we can mitigate some of that and adapt as well.
Awesome. James, how can we connect with you? Whether is that podcast on social media? Tell us a little bit how they can download the app.
Yeah, so you can download the app. You can go to getscenario.ai to download it, or you can just go to the App Store. We are not yet an Android. We get that request a lot. I apologize. We're still in the beta and kind of building out the core product. And once we do, we absolutely will launch an Android version. So it's only available on iOS today. You can go to the App Store and just search Scenario, or you could go to getscenario.ai. You'll find me on LinkedIn.
Awesome. James, thanks for sharing with us today.
Yeah. Pleasure to spend time with you, James.
Yeah. Thank you both.
Well, that brings us to the end of another episode of the Market Makers podcast. A special thank you to James Veraldi for joining us and for giving us a glimpse into how Scenario is using AI and visualization to offer a whole new way to engage with mental health. Also, friendly disclaimer, Bright Ventures, a fund I manage, is invested in Scenario. If this conversation sparked your interest, make sure to subscribe to the Market Makers podcast, leave us a review, and share this episode with anyone else who's passionate about mental health and AI. You can also follow us at ImpactAlpha and wherever else you stream podcasts to stay up to date on what's next and hear insights from more industry leaders. Thanks again for listening to the Market Makers podcast. I'm Lenore Champagne-Beirne, and remember, technology is not just changing business, it can transform our lives for good.